Hello and welcome to the new episode of Spookier Times, a podcast of horror, gothic, and weird fiction across media. This episode is a little bit different because we're going to be looking at the best films of 2020 in horror, sci-fi, and fantasy. I consider all those part of the weird fiction umbrella. It's really where my specialty lies. I'm known as a horror person. I've studied science fiction and fantasy just as much. So right now, I'm going to list off all the horror, sci-fi, and fantasy that actually made my top 11 films of 2020 list. I already wrote an article on it. I've been making daily TikTok videos breaking down why each of these films is on the list. You can find all the links. I want to talk about a few honorable mentions as the meat of this podcast. So the films on the top 11 films of 2020 list in no particular order. 1BR, the apartment gothic horror film about the woman moving into the new community, only to discover there are other rules she needs to abide by and tests she needs to pass to finally be at home. We have Guns Akimbo, the action sci-fi horror comedy film starring Daniel Radcliffe and Samara Weaving as contestants in a deadly live-streamed reality show. Samara actually wants to fight. She's the villain of the film for a while, and Daniel Radcliffe is a troll who went to the wrong chat room and made the wrong people mad. Next up, The Turning. I already did actually an entire podcast episode on Florio Sigismondi's The Turning. That's the Turn of the Screw episode. Love this adaptation. We Summon the Darkness is a heavy metal meets evangelical 1980s slasher film about three young women who meet up with three young men at a heavy metal show and they decide to party together afterwards. Promising Young Woman is going to be available to stream any day now. Instead of having to go to the theaters to see it, please don't. It is not safe right now. It is an amazing revenge film starring Carey Mulligan as a woman. The basic premise is she goes to bars, pretends to be inebriated, and gets men to bring her home. And if they try to do more than just make sure she goes home safely, she reveals the truth and ends their life. Loved it. It is messy, it is weird, it is wrong, it is right, it is everything it intends to be. I loved it. Onward, the Disney Pixar urban fantasy, high fantasy hybrid about that world where monsters are real but no one practices magic anymore and the rules actually can be defined through Dungeons and Dragons. And two teenagers receive a gift that their father had created a spell to bring him back to life after he died when one was a toddler and the other one wasn't born yet. And they are on an epic quest to bring him to life and spend one day with their father now that they can remember him. And let's see, we got a couple more. Birds of Prey, or The Fantabulous Emancipation of Harley Quinn. One of my favorite superhero films of all time. I did a great analysis actually on TikTok about how it's a modernist superhero film, which explains the timelines, the unreliable narrators, all that kind of stuff. And last but not least, scanning the list, Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street, one of the most important queer entertainment documentaries of all time, looking at Mark Patton's rise and fall from fame, peaking at the release of Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, but really used as a way to discuss homophobia and the AIDS crisis and how it impacted or was mistreated by Hollywood in the 1980s. Anyway, now that we've gotten those out of the way, read the article, find the videos on TikTok. Let's look at some of these honorable mentions. Let's look at fantasy, which sadly only has 2 entries in it. It was kind of a dry well for fantasy film. Fantasy literature and video games soared in 2020, but films, they didn't come out. They weren't released. They didn't make it to the United States. There's wonderful international fantasy produced every year, and it takes a long time to come in. Even one of these films barely got released in the US because its original release date got cut short and mishandled and changed because of COVID. So let's start with that one. That is an anime film called A Whisker Away. It doesn't reinvent the wheel, but it's a really gentle story told very, very well. A high school girl has a crush on a boy and she's willing to do anything to get closer to him and get his attention. So she meets a mysterious mask maker who gives her a cat mask, a ceramic cat mask, that has her transform into a cat who the boy then adopts. She gets to be close to him and find out all about him, and she believes she's happier when she's near him so her own human face falls off, and the mask collector takes it to give to a cat who actually wants to be a human. Like I said, these are all anime tropes. You've heard these stories before. A Whisker Away is just done really well. The English dub is good. Subtitles are just as good. I would go with the original audio on this one. I think there's a little bit of nuance lost in the dub, but either way is great. You can find it online. The second honorable mention in the fantasy realm is Jingle Jangle. This Netflix holiday musical is great for a lot of reasons. One, the inclusion of a BIPOC cast, a young black girl as the lead, a Christmas story centered around a black family of inventors, a musical film on as wide a platform as Netflix being heavily promoted with a BIPOC cast. Like, there's issues with the robot in the narrative, but the robot is played by Ricky Martin, which is its own, like, okay. So there's queer and Latino representation in that as well. Basically, a family of toy makers has their greatest invention stolen, so the girl goes on an adventure to get it back. I think it's a little too long. It probably could have dealt with some trimming, and some of the robot stuff doesn't quite land right. It's a very sassy robot. He's self-aware. Lots of witty catchphrases, not very witty. Lots of jokes about smelly things. It's okay. It's cute. The music is great. Costumes, acting, all of that amazing. I recommend watching it. Moving on to Sci-Fi, where I have 3 recommendations for you. And the first one, some people had under 2019 lists. It wasn't really available in the US until 2020. The animation branch has weird rules, so it was eligible in last year's ceremony, but it didn't actually release in the United States until like the late winter, early spring, right about a month before quarantine happened. It's called Weathering with You, and it's kind of a sci-fi fantasy blend, so you could count this as the third film in each of these categories. Basically, there's a town where there is no rain, and the people are suffering. And this boy finds a girl who can produce rain at will. It's beautiful, it's touching, it's moving, the animation is immaculate. It's really good. It's really good for what it is. It's not the greatest film ever made, but it is a really cool piece of like sci-fi, fantasy, there's some techno stuff going on. I really liked it. Next up is a sci-fi horror film called The Platform. I've written a review about this on my website, sketchingdetails.com. This is a dystopian prison complex film. It is the unspecified, but it seems pretty near future, where both inmates and people who need a favor from the government can agree to serve their time out in a vertically oriented prison with hundreds of floors where a giant platform raises and lowers once a day. It starts at the top floor with a full-on banquet with enough food to feed everyone. And it lowers and lowers and lowers. And the people at the top are perfectly happy to eat all they want to, and the people at the bottom starve to death. And every month you're randomly reassigned to a new floor. This is twisted, it's dark, it's weird. It's a really cool concept. It's shot very well, the acting's very good. I think, like Jingle Jangle, it's a little too long, but it's cool. It's cool for what it is. Speaking of cool for what it is, our third sci-fi film is another kind of sci-fi horror. And it is Possessor from Brandon Cronenberg. Brandon Cronenberg is David Cronenberg's son. And if he continues producing body horror at the rate and escalation that he is producing body horror, his father will not be the master of body horror anymore. Possessor is already as good in this vein as some of Cronenberg's top films. Like, this is on the level of Videodrome and The Fly. Basically, we have developed technology that assassins can transform into other bodies. They can take over other people's bodies through medical science. And one assassin believes she's losing her touch as the bodies don't quite want to stay on her, which becomes an issue as she starts messing up on the job because her disguise is literally falling off of her. This is disturbing. It is scary. It is weird science fiction. This is like Ex Machina, finding the bodies in the closet level of weird. It's not my favorite, but I'll say it is notable for the year. There's some really cool ideas being played with here. Finally, we're going to end on my category, my best category, horror. These are some strange ones. You want to talk strange? We're going to talk strange. First up is Cadaver, which is a Spanish language horror film. It is also a dystopian story, so there are some sci-fi elements. Essentially, there was a nuclear explosion that destroyed large swaths of the population around the world. People are suffering, people are starving, and a former actress convinces her family to join her for a free night of theater where they were given tickets on the street. This is inspired by the Grand Guignol movement in France, which if you don't know what that is, it's the origins of horror theatricality. They would do things like raising the dead and then sleeping with them on stage for laughs, but then murder everyone on stage theatrically, not for real, but like there'd be murders, there'd be executions, there'd be possessions, all acted out, full gore, full violence, to an audience of people howling. And this was in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s. Cadaver's playing with that, but mixing it with like those immersive shows like Sleep No More. Because once the show begins and everyone's had their feast to start it off, you wander freely through this giant hotel following the actors as they cause murder and mayhem and chaos to each other and the guests themselves. It's cool. It's really cool. This one came close to my list. It really did. Speaking of close to my list, Swallow was split on almost making the top 11. I didn't want to do a top 13, and I couldn't choose between it and What the Constitution Means to Me for that number 12 slot, so they both got the cut. Swallow is a body horror film. Notice the trend here. I love body horror. It is a body horror film about a pregnant woman who becomes obsessed with swallowing small objects as a secret, as something she can hide for herself, as something that feels good, as she realizes the control of her life is slowly slipping away, as her husband and in-laws start exerting more and more influence over her life, because she's not exactly the perfect bride they wanted her to be. This is such a cool horror film. The acting, the art design, oh my god, most beautiful horror film since Revenge, with those, those beautiful pink and blue glass windows I obsessed about in my review. Swallow has the pink one, so I'm already on board. It's really cool. I think the reason why I didn't vibe with it as much when I'm reviewing like the year, like deciding what's the best, it fell off the list because there's a twist in the third act that brings it from horror to like indie character study, and it does it really well, but then it's not as effective a horror film as it originally was. I still love it. I adore this film. I just don't think it quite lands what it initially set up to do. Last but not least on our honorable mention list is the Zoom horror film you had to know it was coming, Host. Host was filmed during quarantine with actors socially distanced from each other because it was shot over Zoom in their homes. It is so cool. It uses all the things that drive you mad about Zoom. The audio cuts out. There's inconsistency in video quality. People start freezing up and audio stutter, all that kind of stuff. Like you raise the volume and because I'm like, oh, I didn't turn on natural audio and suddenly it's boom. You're exploded with these sounds that create jump scares. It is so cool. So like a group of friends get together to hold a virtual seance. They're all told to bring an object that means something to them. Like, oh, maybe I bring my little possum friend here. Aww. And then the psychic is trying to lead them through. Something goes wrong with the ritual, and suddenly, ghosts may or may not actually be appearing. I will say, massive content warning. There are some jokes about death by suicide that are really in poor taste, but like that's why it's nowhere near my actual top 11. But this is to Zoom what Unfriended was to social media 10 years ago. It is going to go down as a landmark piece of innovative indie horror filmmaking. So that is going to be the end of our special 2020 in review episode of Spookier Times. I am your host, Robert J. Gannon. You can find me there on all social media at Robert J. Gannon. My website is sketchingdetails.com. I just put out a book called Hashtag 31 Days, a collection of horror essays, Volume 1, that you can find at my coffee. You can find it at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Kobe, Apple Books. The audiobook is rolling out. The best place to get it is my coffee, ko-fi.com/Robert J. Gannon/shop. That is the only place where, as a self-publishing author, I get all the proceeds. Amazon is the absolute worst place, but if it's the easiest for you, I want you reading this book. Other than that, I stream on Twitch 5 days a week at 7:30 a.m. Eastern. We play horror games and whatever else I want to play. And yeah, enjoy the new year. Have fun exploring these wonderful films. And I can't wait to see what cinematic masterpieces in horror, gothic, and weird fiction appear in the new calendar year.